Have you ever sat and thought, why God? Why is this happening to me? Or why did this happen in the world? And cried about it? Well, some people in this world think that either God doesn't exist because if he did, nothing bad would happen, or that God exists, but he's not as good as everyone thinks because all these bad things happen. Either we blame God or we just purely say that he doesn't exist. Well, let's think about a few things here. So God gave us power over all these things that happen in our lives through acceptance of Jesus' death and resurrection. When suffering comes to us, we want to know what or who has caused it. The answer to that question often affects how we respond to the pain. We focus immediately on the obvious causes. For an illness, we think about what has gone wrong with our body's biochemistry. After an accident, we visit and revisit what happened, how it happened, and whose fault it was. It's easy to blame others or things for our problems and not look at ourselves first. Avoiding personal responsibility for our actions, whether being fired from a job, losing retirement savings in the Great Recession, or the actions of a disobedient child. Our first tendency is to look for external causes and not finding a clear one. Blame the mean boss, the system, the doctor, or even God. If God is loving and kind, how could he allow this to happen? The simple answer is he didn't, and he doesn't, and he never will. For a certainty, God does not act wickedly, as seen in Job 34, verse 12. Secondly, the Bible clearly teaches that God does not cause us to suffer. For example, the Bible says that when we go through trials, it would be a mistake to say, I am being tried by God. Why? Because with evil things, God cannot be tried, nor does he himself try anyone, as seen in James 1 verse 13. In other words, God never causes the trials we face or the suffering that follows. To do so would be wicked, but God does not act wickedly, as seen in Job 34 verse 12. If God does not cause us to suffer, then who or what does? Sadly, humans are often victimized by other imperfect humans, as seen in Ecclesiastes 8 verse 9. Additionally, we may face calamities because of unexpected events, that is, because of simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, as seen in Ecclesiastes 9 verse 11. The Bible teaches that ultimately, the ruler of this world, the Satan, the devil, the enemy, the wicked one, that he's responsible for human suffering, for the whole world is lying in the power of the wicked one, as seen in John 12 verse 31 and 1 John 5 verse 19. It is the enemy, not God, who causes people to suffer. Does God care about our suffering? Well, during all their distress, it was distressing to him, as seen in Isaiah 63 verse 9. Thirdly, some think that God is indifferent to our trials. They may call out God's apparent lack of mercy or pity in reaction to our suffering. They argue that if God exists, he must view humans with pitiless indifference. Well, what does the Bible say? Far from depicting God as pitiless or indifferent, the Bible teaches that God is deeply moved by our suffering, and that he will soon bring an end to it. Consider 3 comforting truths found in the Bible. Firstly, God is aware of our suffering. From the very start of human suffering, not a single teardrop has gone unnoticed by God, whose watchful eyes see everything, as seen in Psalm 11 verse 4 and Psalm 56 verse 8. For example, when his worshippers in ancient times were being oppressed, God said, I've certainly seen the affliction of my people, but was he only vaguely aware of their pain? No, for he added, I well know the pains they suffer, as seen in Exodus 3 verse 7. Many people have found comfort in that truth alone, the thought that God is aware of everything we suffer, even the trials that others may not be aware of or fully understand, as seen in Psalm 31 verse 7 and Proverbs 14 verse 10. Secondly, God feels for us when we suffer. God is not only aware of human suffering, but also deeply moved by it. For example, God was sincerely troubled when his ancient worshippers faced trials. During all their distress, it was distressing to him, says the Bible, as seen in Isaiah 63 verse 9. Although God is vastly superior to humans, he feels empathy for those who suffer, as if their pain were in his heart. Indeed, God is very compassionate and merciful, as seen in James 5 verse 11. Additionally, God helps us to bear our suffering, as seen in Philippians 4 verse 12 and 13. Thirdly, God will end all human suffering. According to the Bible, God will bring an end to the suffering of every human on the planet, by means of his heavenly kingdom, that is. God will drastically change the human condition for the better. Regarding that time, the Bible promises that God will wipe out every tear from their eyes, and death will be no more, neither will mourning nor outcry nor pain be any more. The former things have passed away, as seen in Revelation 21 verse 4. What about those who have already died? Well, God will bring them back to life here on earth, so that they too can enjoy life free from suffering, as seen in John 5 verse 28 and 29. Will anyone be plagued by painful memories of past suffering? No, for God's promises, the former things will not be called to mind, nor will they come up into the heart, as seen in Isaiah 65 verse 17. Another point. You might wonder if it's wrong to ask why God allows suffering. Some worry that asking such a question means that they do not have enough faith, or that they are showing disrespect for God. When reading the Bible, however, you'll find that faithful, God-fearing people had similar questions. For example, the prophet Habakkuk asked God, "Why do you make me witness wrongdoing? And why do you tolerate oppression? Why are destruction and violence before me? And why do quarreling and conflict abound?" As seen in Habakkuk 1 verse 3. Did God scold the faithful prophet Habakkuk for asking such questions? No. Instead, God included Habakkuk's sincere words in the inspired Bible record. God also helped him to get a clearer understanding of matters and to gain greater faith. Remember, the Bible teaches that he cares for you, as seen in 1 Peter 5 verse 7. God hates wickedness and the suffering it causes far more than any human does, as seen in Isaiah 55 verse 8 and 9. Why then is there so much suffering in the world? Do you know why people make the mistake of blaming God for all the suffering in the world? In many cases, they blame Almighty God because they think that he is the real ruler of this world. They do not know the simple but important truth that the Bible teaches. The real ruler of this world is the enemy, Satan, the devil. Also, the Bible clearly states the whole world is lying in the power of the wicked one, as seen in 1 John 5 verse 19. When you think about it, does that not make sense? This world reflects the personality of the invisible spirit creature who is misleading the entire inhabited earth, as seen in Revelation 12 verse 9. Satan is hateful, deceptive, and cruel, so the world, under his influence, is full of hatred, deceit, and cruelty. That is one reason why there is so much suffering. A second reason why there is so much suffering is that mankind has been imperfect and sinful ever since the rebellion in the Garden of Eden. Sinful humans tend to struggle for dominance, and this results in wars, oppression, and suffering, as seen in Ecclesiastes 4 verse 1 and 8 verse 9. A third reason for suffering is time and unexpected events. Read Ecclesiastes 9 verse 11. In a world without God as a protective ruler, people may suffer because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. This specific case can be helped when you accept God into your life through accepting Jesus' sacrifice and resurrection, as seen in the New Testament. To find out why God allows suffering, we need to think back to the time when suffering began. When the enemy led Adam and Eve into disobeying God, an important question was raised. The enemy did not call into question God's power. Even Satan knows that there is no limit to God's power. Rather, he questioned God's right to rule. By calling God a liar who withholds good from his subjects, the enemy charged that God is a bad ruler. Read Genesis 3, verse 2-5. The enemy implied that mankind would be better off without God's rulership. This was an attack on God's sovereignty, his right to rule. Adam and Eve rebelled against God. In effect, they said, "We do not need God as our ruler. We can decide for ourselves what is right and what is wrong." How could God settle that issue? How could he teach all intelligent creatures that the rebels were wrong and that his way truly was best? Someone might say that God should simply have destroyed the rebels and made a fresh start. But God had stated his purpose to fill the earth with the offspring of Adam and Eve, and he wanted them to live in an earthly paradise, seen in Genesis 1 verse 28. God always fulfills his purposes and promises, as seen in Isaiah 55 verse 10 to 11. Besides that, getting rid of the rebels in Eden would not have answered the question that had been raised regarding God's right to rule. Let's consider an illustration. Imagine that a teacher is telling his students how to solve a difficult problem. A clever but rebellious student claims that the teacher's way of solving the problem is wrong, implying that the teacher is not capable. This rebel insists that he knows a much better way to solve the problem. Some students think that he is right, and they also become rebellious. What should the teacher do? If he throws the rebels out of the class, what will be the effect on the other students? Will they not believe that their fellow student was right and those who joined him are right? All the other students in the class might lose respect for the teacher, thinking that he is afraid of being proved wrong. But suppose that the teacher allows the rebel to show the class how he would solve the problem. God has done something similar to what the teacher does. Remember that the rebels in Eden were not the only ones involved. Millions of angels were watching, as seen in Job 38 verse 7 and Daniel 7 verse 10. How God handled the rebellion would greatly affect all those angels and eventually all intelligent creation. So, what has God done? He has allowed the enemy to show how he would rule mankind. God has also allowed humans to govern themselves under the enemy's guidance. The teacher in our illustration knows that the rebel and the students on his side are wrong, but he also knows that allowing them the opportunity to try to prove their point will benefit the whole class. When the rebel fails, all honest students will see that the teacher is the only one qualified to lead the class. They'll understand why the teacher therefore removes any rebels from the class. Similarly, God knows that all honest-hearted humans and angels will benefit from seeing that the enemy and his fellow rebels have failed, and that humans cannot govern themselves. Like Jeremiah, they will learn this vital truth. I will know, O God, that man's way does not belong to him. It does not belong to man who is walking even to direct his step, as seen in Jeremiah 10 verse 23. Why, though, has God allowed suffering to go on for so long? And why does he not prevent bad things from happening? Well, consider two things that the teacher in our illustration would not do. First, he would not stop the rebel student from presenting his case. Second, the teacher would not help the rebel to make his case. Similarly, consider two things that God has determined not to do. First, he has not stopped the enemy and those who side with him from trying to prove that they are right. Allowing time to pass has thus been necessary. In the thousands of years of human history, mankind has been able to try every form of self-rule or human government. Mankind has made some advances in science and other fields, but injustice, poverty, crime, and war have grown ever worse. Human rule has now been shown to be a complete failure. Second, God has not helped the enemy to rule this world. If God were to prevent horrible crimes, for instance, would he not in effect be supporting the case of the rebels? Would God not be making people think that perhaps humans can govern themselves without disastrous results? If God were to act in that way, he would become party to a lie. However, it's impossible for God to lie, as seen in Hebrews 6 verse 18. What, though, about all the harm that has been done during the long rebellion against God? We do well to remember that God is almighty. Therefore, he can and will undo the effects of mankind's suffering. As we have already learned, the ruining of our planet will be undone by the turning of the earth into paradise. The effects of sin will be removed through faith in Jesus' sacrifice, and the effects of death will be reversed by means of the resurrection. God will thus use Jesus to break up the works of the devil, as seen in 1 John 3 verse 8. God will bring all of this about at just the right time. We can be glad that he has not acted sooner, for his patience has given us the opportunity to learn the truth and to serve him. Read 2 Peter 3 verse 9 and 10 for this. Meanwhile, God has been actively seeking sincere worshippers and helping them to endure any suffering that may come upon them in this troubled world. Read John 4 verse 23 and 1 Corinthians 10 verse 13. Important points to remember so far. God does not cause the bad conditions in the world, as seen in Job 34 verse 10. By calling God a liar and saying that he withholds good from his subjects, the enemy questioned God's right to rule. as seen in Genesis 3 verse 2-5. God will use his Son, the ruler of the Messianic kingdom, Jesus, to end all suffering, human suffering, and to undo its effects, as seen in 1 John 3 verse 8. Some might wonder, could all the suffering have been prevented if God had created Adam and Eve in such a way that they could not rebel? To answer that question, you need to remember a precious gift that God has given you. Humans were created with free will. God has made countless animals, and these are driven largely by instinct, as seen in Proverbs 30 verse 24. Man has made some robots that can be programmed to follow every command. Would we be happy if God had made us like that? No. We're glad to have the freedom to make choices about what kind of person to become, what course of life to pursue, what friendships to form, and so on and so forth. We love to have a measure of freedom, and that is what God wants us to enjoy. God is not interested in service performed under compulsion. See 2 Corinthians 9 verse 7. To illustrate, what would please a parent more? A child saying, "I love you," because he is told to say it, or his saying it freely from the heart? The enemy, Adam and Eve, made the worst possible use of free will. They rejected God. You have the opportunity to put the gift of free will to the best possible use. You can join God's side and take an active part in proving the enemy a liar and a miserable failure as a ruler, as seen in Proverbs 27 verse 11. You can do that by choosing the right course of life and accepting Jesus' sacrifice, his death on the cross, and resurrection as atonement for your sins. With Jesus, you can enter into a personal relationship with God the Father and be rest assured that your hope lies in him even as the suffering of the world rages on. Moving on. In the case of natural disasters, science and our own intelligence teaches us to neither blame God nor mindless and relentless nature. When we understand God as the initial impulse for all creation, we also understand God as the creator of our self-motivation, self-determination, self-awareness, and free will. We know that God gave human beings those intelligent and creative attributes to overcome the myriad of forces imposed or exacted by nature. We know that we can anticipate disasters, prepare for them, and save lives as a result. God is not responsible for our personal problems or deficiencies, whether individually or collectively, because we each are all products of our environment, the natural order we find ourselves a part of, and nature's environment, beginning at birth. Is God responsible for the pain in my left shoulder caused by a fall? Or for the mentally deranged who hear voices and murder? Or those who incite others to violence as religious terrorists? I think most of us can agree not. The difference, of course, is motivation. Nature has a rigid motivating force to grow, shift, change, and adapt. Nature is not concerned with justice and fairness and the altruism we see in humanity. People all have an animal nature as well, which motivates us to do things from one extreme to the other, some extremely kind and others extremely evil. But even though the animals live according to circumscribed natural tendencies, we can rise above our animal nature and control some of these decisions. We have the free will to act on our conscience and choose justice or injustice. Certain matters are subject to the free will of man, such as acting with justice and fairness, or injustice and iniquity. In other words, the choice of good or evil actions. It's clear and evident that the will of man figures greatly in these actions. But there are certain matters where man is forced and compelled, such as sleep, death, sickness, failing powers, misfortune, and material loss. These are not subject to the will of man, and he's not accountable for them, because he's compelled to endure them. But he is free in the choice of good and evil actions, and it is of his own accord that he performs them. The Bible records many disasters. Some are household names in many parts of the world. Noah's flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, the plagues that visited on Egypt in Moses' time. God is declared to have sent these events as judgments on human sin, understood as human moral failure, where people fail to live and act according to the ways that God has declared to be best. It should be noted, though, that the Bible mentions many disasters without linking them to judgment. For example, famines are noted in the stories of Abraham, Joseph, Naomi, David, Elijah, and the early Christian church. These events are mentioned in various accounts, some leading to significant people movements and other having little obvious significance. God is not said to have had any role in these and other disasters. The implicit message is that disasters happen, and people respond in practical ways, much like today. The Bible does not claim that God's hand of judgment can be seen in every disaster. The Bible states that God created the world and it was very good, as seen in Genesis 1. Our reflections begin with the introduction of humans, which in the Bible starts with Adam and Eve, as mentioned previously. God gives them a few simple commands, but they quickly make a mess of things. They give in to the temptation to do things their own way. They sin and are judged by being driven from the Garden of Eden. No longer will they live in harmony with the world. Childbearing will be painful, work will be toil, and instead of social harmony, conflict and violence will erupt. The claim is that sin led to death and destruction, and that even nature changed. The whole world has been groaning ever since, and bound to a path of decay, as seen in Romans 8 verse 19 to 22. In the biblical account, moral evil spread quickly, and people inflicted more and more pain on one another. God saw that human wickedness became so extensive that judgment was required, resulting in Noah's flood, as seen in Genesis 6 to 8. The biblical claim is that as creator of the universe, God is justified in upholding moral standards and punishing evil. Sometimes he does this using disasters, as declared by many Old Testament prophets. Just as human authorities are entrusted with enforcing their jurisdiction's laws, God has authority over humanity. Human sin fractured the harmonious relationship between God and humans, among humans, and between humans and the environment. This requires a response. Ignoring sin is not compatible with God's justice. We would not tolerate a justice system that lets lawbreakers go free without judgment. As mentioned before, the ultimate response to this breaking of relations due to sin was mended with the sacrifice and resurrection of Jesus to remedy the broken relationship between humans and God. However, it doesn't necessarily remedy relations among all humans and between humans and the environment, which is where the free will and intelligent preparation of men need to be considered. However, God's justice must coexist with his love, which the Bible reveals through his extension of forgiveness. His plans culminate in Jesus' death and resurrection, and his offer of forgiveness as a free gift to all who will accept it, as seen in Ephesians 2, verse 8 to 9. With this comes restoration of someone's relationship with God and spiritual healing. But people continue to live in the world as it now exists. The human body and the natural world continue according to the laws of nature, with sickness, death, and disasters now part of our world. The Bible records some miracles where God intervenes to restore physical health or counteract a law of nature, and sometimes he intervenes with a disaster to judge human sin. But for the most part, illness, death, and disasters continue according to the laws of nature and the outcomes of human choices. The Bible claims that a time will come when the world will be restored after the day of judgment. After that, humans will live in a situation where pain and suffering will no longer exist and creation will be rid of disasters, as seen in Revelation 22. Given the biblical claim that God has sent some disasters as judgment, many wonder if a particular disaster is a judgment from God, even if not God's punishment. They wonder why he would not protect people from harm. The God of Christianity is said to be a loving God who cares for people, and also a powerful God who has authority over nature. Why then does he allow disasters? The Bible claims that God is all-loving and all-powerful. Not all religions hold to this view of a personal God. Reality shows that evil and suffering happen. Surely, an all-powerful God would prevent bad things from happening to the people he loves. Therefore, either God is not all-loving, or he's not all-powerful, or he does not exist. The latter conclusion leads to debates between atheism and theism. While the first two conclusions raise perplexing difficulties for believers, how could the God whom Christians worship allow things like disasters? Within such arguments lies a hidden premise. The assumption is that a loving God prevents bad things from happening to those he loves. Yet, in the real world, we do not live that way. Loving parents allow their children to make age-appropriate choices, some of which have risks and sometimes negative consequences. A parent who refuses to do so, we call overprotective. Loving couples who do not allow their partners to socialize with others, we call domineering or controlling. Within a loving relationship, people do not exercise all the power available to them to ensure everyone does the right thing. The result is that children fall and hurt themselves. They sometimes get into trouble, and people hurt one another in their relationships. The question is whether giving people such freedom is justified. In human relationships, we believe it is. The free will defense is one theodicy that argues that God was justified in creating a world in which humans have real moral freedom. A key theological premise in Christianity, and the other Abrahamic religions, but not Eastern religions, is that God is personal and seeks loving relationships with humans. For relationships to exhibit attributes like love, trust, faith, and so forth, they must be entered into without compulsion. Only if God was more concerned about good behavior than personal relationships would he compel people to believe in him. Love requires freedom. A robot can be programmed to always obey its owner, but then the relationship between the two would not be personal. Freedom risks pain, and hence a child can reject his parents, a spouse can be unfaithful, or a parent can be abusive. These risks are necessary in a world where freedom, love, and personal relationships exist. If God intervened every time we could be hurt, much pain and suffering could be avoided, but our free will would be an illusion. The world as we know it would not exist. Every time someone went to punch another person, his arm would fail to work. Every time someone went to pour pollutants in the environment, the container would not open. So many miracles would have to happen that people could not entertain rational expectations, make predictions, estimate probabilities, or calculate prudence. A world without predictable consequences would make morality and moral responsibility impossible, or at least extremely different to what we understand by morality. Science as we know it would be impossible because God would be interfering constantly with nature and people to prevent human suffering. The result would be a world in which wrong actions were impossible, and in which therefore freedom of the will would be void. Evil thoughts would be impossible, for the cerebral matter which we use in thinking would refuse its task when we attempted to frame them. Such is clearly not the world we inhabit. Thus, our world corresponds well with the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God who so values loving relationships that he allows free will to exist, even though this risks allowing humans to experience pain and suffering. Theodicies have tended to focus on either moral evil, suffering caused by humans, or natural evil, suffering caused by nature, such as natural disasters or genetic defects. The free will defense may seem irrelevant for natural disasters. It clearly applies to such things as sabotage leading to industrial disasters, greed that leads people to cut corners when constructing buildings so that they collapse more easily during earthquakes, hatred that leads to violence and conflict, or war that results in famine or refugee crises. The distinction between natural disasters and man-made or technological disasters is becoming less tenable to hold, making the free will theodicy more relevant to disasters in general. The 18th century philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau reacted to the debate over God's role in the Great Lisbon earthquake, claiming that human decisions were more to blame for the disaster's consequence than nature or God. Responding to Voltaire, he stated, "But it was hardly nature that had assembled there 20,000 houses of 6 or 7 stories. If the residents of this large city had been more evenly dispersed and less densely housed, the losses would have been fewer or perhaps none at all." Robert White notes that the deaths caused by natural disasters can often be attributed, almost in their entirety, to actions taken by people, which turned a natural process into a disaster. In that respect, there is nothing natural about them. As examples, he noted that many who died in the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami were living in areas zoned as unsuitable for houses, but they had nowhere else to live. And in the 2011 Fukushima earthquake in Japan, most fatalities were among those who ignored the warnings to flee the tsunami because they assumed the seawalls would protect them. A report prepared by the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development concluded that the deaths in New Orleans should not be blamed on Hurricane Katrina. This catastrophe did not result from an act of God. It resulted from acts of people, because of a large number of flaws and defects that had been embedded in the system. The free will defense is applicable to such human decisions, but critics, like yourself, still question why an all-powerful God would not eliminate large-scale disasters that bring massive destruction and many casualties. The natural law theodicy was hinted at above, which raises the necessity of an orderly universe governed by natural law. In a world where choices are to be judged as good or bad, a significant amount of predictability is required. Having a good degree of confidence in the consequences of choices is necessary to hold people accountable ethically. If man is to have a free and responsible choice of destiny, he needs to have a range of actions open to him, whose consequences, good and evil, he understands, and he can only have that understanding in a world which already has built into it many natural processes productive of both good and evil. When a boulder moves on a mountainside, we know that it'll roll downhill and not uphill. When we see a natural rock fall, we know that rolling rocks wreak havoc. We learn from nature that boulders rolling onto roads and hitting cars will probably injure or kill passengers, cause grief to their relatives and friends, and fear in other motorists. If the boulder was to stop rolling because its path could result in suffering, or if trees could be smashed but not cars because their occupants would be hurt, we would lose much of our ability to predict outcomes, and this would eliminate accountability and true moral choice. Therefore, God is justified in allowing a world with potentially catastrophic events, even if this can result in pain and suffering for humans. Critics of natural law theodicy argue that God could have made a world where physical pain and suffering did not occur. In other words, a heavenly world. Remember, though, that God did create the heavenly world which Adam and Eve started in, but purely by choices of their own making, fell from grace and introduced sin and suffering into the world. They lost their original dominion over the earth and handed the keys over to Satan by trusting his word over God's word. But anyway, this raises questions about why the physical world exists. Given that the physical world does exist and that we are born into it, another criticism is that the world could have different natural laws which lead to much less human suffering. However, natural laws are not abstract mathematical equations, but descriptions of how natural objects act and react under certain conditions. To change these laws would require changing the very nature of these objects. For example, water would have to become something in which people could not drown. This would change many related properties that make water the material we recognize and which supports life. We have no way of predicting what non-drowning water would be like, and certainly no way of knowing if it would lead to a world with less suffering. In this case, the burden of proof is on the critic to provide a model of a universe with alternative natural laws. The destructiveness of such events is clear and tragic, but their elimination would not be so straightforwardly beneficial. But, paradoxically, many of the processes that make it possible for humans to live on Earth are the same as those that give rise to disasters. Floods negatively affect more people than all other disasters combined, yet they are essential for soil fertility. For millennia, the flooding of the River Nile enabled the agricultural prosperity that allowed Egypt to flourish. In 1783, the largest volcanic eruptions in Iceland for 1,000 years led to reduced rainfall in Africa. The following year, the Nile did not flood, and then the crops failed, leading to a famine where 1/6 of Egypt's population either died or left the country. In similarly paradoxical ways, earthquakes are both destructive and allow minerals and nutrients to emerge from within the earth and allow life to thrive. We have no idea whether life on Earth would be possible without the events we call disasters. What can be concluded from such theological reflections is that rational justifications can be provided to address why the God of the Bible could allow disasters to occur. Whether these are found to be convincing or not is another matter. This depends on whether you're willing to believe that the Bible's God is trustworthy and loving, in spite of the existence of disasters and the suffering they bring. This gets at the core of what faith involves: a willingness to act on the basis of trust in spite of the lack of certainty. As with most areas of life, evidence takes us only so far. At some point, a faith decision must be made based on trust and not certainty. Even with theodicies, people grapple with the personal dimension of suffering. Many will be more concerned about why disaster struck here and now, not whether God was justified. People ask, why didn't God protect us? Or what have we done to deserve this? Jesus was asked whether a group of Galileans, killed by Pilate, and whether 18 people killed when a tower fell on them were worse sinners than others living in Jerusalem, as seen in Luke 13, verse 1-5. He replied with an emphatic no. Instead, Jesus called on his listeners to consider their own standing before God. Jesus implies that people are injured and killed in disasters because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another time, Jesus was asked if a man was born blind because of his own sin or that of his parents, as seen in John 9, verse 1-3. Again, he categorically denied that the blindness was due to anyone's sin. Instead, he said that God would be revealed in this man's life. Sickness, injury, or death, in a disaster or any other situation, cannot be assumed to be God's judgment on a specific sin. Such accounts are in keeping with possibly the most extensive discussion of suffering in the Bible. The book of Job is about a good religious man, better than anyone else on earth, as seen in Job 1 verse 8. Yet God allows one disaster after another to enter his life, resulting in the loss of all his livestock, wealth, and even his 10 children. Then he gets painful sores all over his body. Job's wife questions his integrity and urges him to curse God and die. As he sits in grief and agony, 3 friends come to comfort him. Much like modern speculators of religious judgment, they claim Job's suffering must be due to some terrible sin and urge him to repent. Job adamantly refuses to accept this perspective. In the end, he is vindicated by God. The disasters were not brought on by his sin. Job, like everyone else, is not sinless, but God was not judging Job because of any particular sin. In an ending that many would find difficult to accept, Job was never given an explanation for why the bad things had happened in his life. The Bible's consistent position is that in most cases, we don't know if a particular sickness, disease, or disaster has any divine involvement. We may never know why something happened. Disasters, diseases, and devastation can have purely physical causes like geological upheavals, microbes, or genetic mutations, or can have a mixture of human and natural causes. Christians must also acknowledge that disasters could be divine judgments, since, as noted earlier, the Bible states that God has sent disasters as punishment for human sin. But these accounts note that they happened for specific actions and occurred after many warnings were ignored. Additionally, the book of Jonah recounts the story of Nineveh, whose people listened to God's warnings, changed their behavior, and the disaster was averted. These accounts are very different to those of today, where people attempt to identify God's judging hand with retrospective speculation. Another related difficulty is how the Old Testament repeatedly states that God will reward those who obey his law and punish those who do not. See Deuteronomy 11, verse 26-28. The theological context for such statements is important. These rewards and punishments were promised to ancient Israel as part of a covenant entered willingly during a period when God's kingdom was geophysical as well as spiritual, as seen in Deuteronomy 5 verse 27. Although God brought disaster on the Israelites when they failed to live up to their side of the agreement, he repeatedly sent warnings to them through the prophets. These accounts should not be taken as the normative way God deals with all people at all times. The Bible promises blessings for those who follow God, but also describes how followers get sick, suffer, and eventually die. Faithful followers of God are not immune from pain and suffering, nor the consequences of disasters. The psalmist observed that good things happen to bad people. I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. They have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They are free from the burdens common to man. They are not plagued by human ills. All day long I have been plagued. I have been punished every morning, as seen in Psalm 73, verse 3-5 and 14. People wonder why bad things happen to good people. The Bible's response is that there has only ever been one good person, and he suffered supremely. Jesus, the Son of God, was tortured to death in the most horrific way. We should not be surprised when bad things happen to us, no matter how good we believe we've been. Instead, there is no one who does good, not even one, as seen in Romans 3 verse 12. We are all on the same moral footing with God, which is why we have no basis for thinking one person is better than another or deserves to suffer more or less than another. This returns us to the recognition that human choices are involved in many disasters. Instead of speculation about a disaster being God's judgment on someone or another, disaster should lead to reflection on the values underlying human decisions. We sense that responsibility lies somewhere, but where? John Sobrino is a theologian who has lived through devastating earthquakes and civil war in El Salvador. He draws a loose parallel between theodicy and anthropodicy. Sometimes God is blamed to excuse human beings from their responsibility for evil. We should question God's apparent lack of involvement in disasters, but also reflect carefully about human roles. This may be why disasters cause such deep angst. We're confronted with the gross injustices in the world. Most people live in abject poverty, while the minority consume most of the world's resources. An earthquake is an X-ray of the country. It is mostly the poor who get killed, the poor who are buried, the poor who have to run out with the 4 things they have left, the poor who sleep outdoors, the poor who live in anguish over the future, the poor who face enormous obstacles trying to rebuild their lives, who cannot get financial credit. Such injustice exists in high-income countries too. Hurricane Katrina disproportionately devastated poorer neighborhoods in New Orleans, which years later continued to be the slowest to recover basic amenities. The big question is why we humans regularly make choices to not provide for the poor or the oppressed, even when we have the means to do so. Tragedies like an earthquake have natural causes, of course, but their unequal impact is not due to nature. It stems from the things people do with each other, to each other, against each other. The tragedy is largely the work of our own hands. We shape the planet with massive, cruel, and lasting injustice. This, in part, is why the Bible claims that no one is good and why judgment is justified. In this general sense, disasters can be said to be part of God's judgment. Humans want to run the world their way, and God allows them. Disasters are a reminder that this world is not the way God wanted. Adam and Eve's sin brought judgment that resulted in disease and death, and changed the world. Now, the whole of creation groans and decays. The hope of the afterlife is part of what allows Christians to hold on to the promise of a better life after this valley of the shadow of death, as seen in Psalm 23 verse 4. Even in this life though, God allows suffering to continue, partly to permit human free will, but also to bring good out of the bad. Even though we may never know the cause of a disaster, we can work to bring good from it. This can happen if the exposure of injustice motivates people to work to restore justice, to build back better. It can also happen if it leads people to respond to the disaster by helping those in need. Throughout the Bible, believers are called to aid the poor, the sick, the oppressed, orphans, refugees, anyone who is vulnerable. In part, this is because all humans are made in the image of God, which confers anyone with both inherent dignity and moral responsibility. To live ethically is to act as an authentic image of God, doing what God would do. The Bible portrays God as the defender of the weak and helpless, as seen in Psalm 68, verse 5, Luke 6, verse 20 to 22, and James 1, verse 27. This includes helping those devastated by disasters. For example, during the Roman Empire, the early spread of Christianity was influenced by how Christians responded to plagues. As healthy Romans fled their cities, Christians stayed and helped those in need, sometimes at the cost of their own lives. In the 16th century, Martin Luther commended those Christians who felt God called them to help those afflicted with the Black Death. In the 19th century, Henry Dunant saw firsthand the pain and suffering of wounded soldiers and committed himself to do something about it. He gathered a small group of Swiss Christians united in their theology and the moral sense of the importance of human life, the humane desire to lighten a little the torments of those suffering. And thus was born the Red Cross, and soon led to the First Geneva Convention for the protection of wounded soldiers. Disaster responders are motivated by many reasons, religious and non-religious. Belief in God is not required to help others. The claim here is that followers of the Christian God should be motivated to help those in need. This should go beyond providing aid, as this can be a way to ease one's conscience or avoid addressing underlying injustices. Christianity calls for solidarity with others because all humans are part of one family, all equally images of God. Solidarity means letting oneself be affected by the suffering of other human beings, sharing their pain and tragedy. Jesus is the example here, as he wept over his friend's grief, in John 11, verse 35. Suffered on the cross and knows what it is like to suffer. The God of the Bible feels with humanity and takes on the pain of their suffering. Injustice is deeply rooted in the world and within people. We may not be willing to change until we experience suffering, either ours or others. Things that contribute to a person's humbling, to his awareness of his own evil, and to his unhappiness with his present state contribute to his willing God's help. Sometimes it takes a disaster to bring this to our attention. Theological reflection about disasters must include some discussion about personal responses to disasters. Those with little time for religion may be skeptical about this, but it is key for believers. Such responses may only make sense after someone has spent time getting to know God. Joseph, well known for his technicolor coat, is an important biblical example. His brothers beat him up and sold him into slavery. He would gain some freedom, only to suffer at the hands of someone else's evil schemes. Eventually, a disastrous famine gave Joseph the opportunity to do good for his captors and be reunited with his brothers. Rather than seek vengeance on them, he declared that while they intended to harm him, God brought good out of their evil intentions, as seen in Genesis 50, verse 20. God did not cause the suffering, nor encourage his brothers and others to harm Joseph, but he brought good from several bad situations. Central to that outcome was Joseph continuing to trust God in the midst of violence, betrayal, and disasters. Likewise, Paul in the New Testament states that in all things, including all types of evil and disasters, God works for the good of those who love him, as seen in Romans 8, verse 28, which is not offered as an answer to why a disaster happens or who is to blame. Likewise, it may be clear how or when or to whom the good will come, but the promise of good is given to those who trust him. This is why waiting on God is a central theological theme. At the same time, the Bible does not claim that pain and suffering should be accepted stoically or without protest. Psalms are the prayers of the Bible and show that lament and crying and protest in the midst of bad times are appropriate. Why, Lord, do you hide yourself in times of trouble? How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? My God, why have you forsaken me? As seen in Psalm 10, 13, and 22. When situations are overwhelming, the only response left for a believer is to cling to God, my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer, as seen in Psalm 18, verse 2. In the Psalms and the story of Job, answers are not provided. The same was noted above in Jesus' response to why questions. Easy explanations for the causes of disasters are not provided. Guarantees that God will prevent or remove suffering are not provided. Answers that God will quickly make everything good do not help. Instead, faith offers confidence that God can be trusted in the midst of suffering, even if it remains unclear and uncertain. This trust is based on the nature of God's character, being loving, faithful, and just, and not any particular outcome, no matter how desirable. Such faith includes the hope that in the future, maybe as far away as the afterlife, things will be rectified and restored to the way God intended. In this way, religious faith, for those who believe, can contribute to personal resilience in the midst of disasters. Disasters remind us that the world is not the way it should be. The world contains much beauty, and the Bible, particularly the Psalms, uses this to point towards the beauty and awe that is part of God's character. But the world also contains terrifying parts. We are not in control of our world. The world is beautiful, but it's also dangerous. C.S. Lewis represented God as a lion in the Chronicles of Narnia. One character asked if the lion is safe. Safe? He wrote. Who said anything about safe? 'Course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. God created the world with love and beauty, and humans introduced sin and ugliness. This requires a just response, which theology calls God's judgment. Injustice demands justice. Ask any victim. God's judgment is how the Bible describes the bringing of justice. The Bible records that this has happened with specific events from time to time, but it does not claim that every disaster is the direct act of God. Various theodicies have provided justifications for why God allows disasters to continue. The Bible says that someday this will end and the world will be restored to how it should have been. Meanwhile, living in this imperfect world, God uses suffering and disasters to call people back to himself and to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with him, as seen in Micah 6 verse 8. Such beliefs should impact someone's ethics and actions. Those who believe in a generous, loving God should express that love in practical ways. Those with the world's possessions should be moved with compassion for those in need and act in practical ways, as seen in 1 John 3 verse 16. Since God has a particular concern for the vulnerable, Christians should also, as seen in James 1 verse 27. Given the view that all humans are made in the image of God, discrimination and injustice are unethical. At the same time, each believer is on a journey to take on more of God's character traits as his or her own character undergoes ethical transformation. And when Christians are hit by disasters, our belief that God can bring good from a bad situation should provide hope and resilience. Disasters should cause all of us to reflect deeply on what matters most in life. They remind us that we are not in control in this world, and we will all ultimately face death. The Bible rejects the tendency to speculate about disasters as God's judgment on past behavior, but instead calls on people to reflect on where we each stand with God. We don't need to be good enough to earn his acceptance. We are asked to be humble enough to accept his goodness and grace given to us as imperfect as we are through acceptance of Jesus. Disasters remind us that all people deserve our help. They call on people to commit themselves to helping those in need, both through meeting their immediate needs in the disaster and working to overcome the injustices that exist in the world and contribute to the devastation of disasters. So my question to you is this. When you ask God, why did this happen? Why don't you instead think about God, who has to see everything and has to let it happen to prove that the enemy is not the best ruler for this world? Have you ever cried for God, thinking that he has to see so much in this world and he can't look away? When we cry because we've seen one thing that didn't allow us to sleep for a week, what do you think about God, who has to see millions of things every second? What do you think he's feeling? Instead of thinking about yourself, think about God. We may deserve bad things in this life because we do bad things. It's not our fault, but we do bad things. Jesus was perfect and he was hurt. Did he deserve it? No. He was perfect. He was good. And he was hurt. So ask yourself, God, who is perfect, does he deserve to be hurt, seeing everything in our world? Instead of blaming God and giving him more pain when he's already had enough pain to deal with, why don't you just thank him? Thank him for everything that he's done for you. And thank him for keeping you today, because you might not have woken up this morning to even listen to this. Instead of blaming God, thank him, give him glory, and just feel for him. Understand that God does not deserve to see what men have chosen to do to others because of the evil that has permeated our world. God's feelings are more than yours. He sees more than you do.